Now, today we're looking at the economic future of Nigeria, and there are stark warnings, as yet unheeded, that this country is getting to the point where it simply cannot continue to sustain, for instance, the money that government officials spend on themselves. Add to this the fact that expert opinion from no less than the likes of the IMF appears to be indicating that the broad-based reforms embarked upon by the Tinubu government have made virtually no impact 18 months on. The growth rate of 3.19% is below the regional average, and inflation is trending upwards at 33.8%, which is way above the government's target of 21% in 2024. In fact, the IMF specifically mentioned Nigeria as one of the countries that's been unable to tame inflation and has recorded much worse exchange rate instability and currency depreciation in 2024. Add to this the impact of the debt burden on fiscal stability, and you can see how this country is listing desperately like a sinking ship. Well, that IMF assessment was delivered at the Lagos Business School. And for more on that, I'm joined now from our studios in Lagos by the Director of the Public Sector Initiative at the Lagos Business School, Dr. Franklin Ngwu, who's also an Associate Professor in Strategy, Corporate Governance and Risk Management. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Ngwu, for joining us. So in effect, the IMF has downgraded Nigeria's growth outlook. Is that a fair assessment?
I think IMF, when they came, they gave an economic outlook of sub-Saharan Africa. So invariably, they looked at different countries, but they're also saying why some countries are doing well in terms of their reforms, some countries are not doing well, some countries can do better. And they are also saying that, for example, Nigeria, we can do certain things better with regards to our reforms and the way we've sequenced it and the outcome that we are seeing. So with regards to, more or less, they are saying that countries who are doing fiscal consolidation, who are more or less doing some other reforms, are now saying that the fiscal deficit is reducing, the fiscal consolidation is working, exchange rate is gradually stabilizing, and growth is emerging. But we are not seeing that in some countries, including Nigeria. So it's a big issue.
And the impression that many in the public have is that the IMF, in its assessment at your Lagos Business School, has essentially said that some of the Tinubu government's economic policies are not working. Is that an accurate picture of what they said?
No, what IMF said, as I said, as IMF were looking at sub-Saharan Africa, not particularly Nigeria, but of course there are outliers in Africa, or there are certain countries in Africa which they highlighted in terms of some of the reforms that are doing, that are working, like Côte d'Ivoire and other countries. But they're also saying that for us in Nigeria, which we've said earlier on, there's a need for better sequencing of these reforms. There's a better assessment, there's a need for better communication of this reform. There's a need for better engagement of these reforms. And there's a need for better signaling of the benefits of this reform before the reform, during the reform, and maybe after some of the reforms. So IMF is more or less, of course, they provide advice in terms of what countries can do. They also help in capacity development. So more or less for us to pick what the report and see the improvements we need to make in regards to the different reforms that are being implemented by the government.
But I mean,
out and say this
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I mean, we're just trying to understand these things because, you know, you economists and you know, you guys are full of technicalese. So for the ordinary person like me and lots of other people on the streets, they need to understand exactly whether that means that the policies are not working in layman's terms. And the other question, of course, is whether or not the IMF which is seen by many as the group that imposes very punishing sort of reforms on a country, whether when they say that the reforms are not working or suggest that, I mean, are they suggesting that the government should deepen those reforms? And the fear, of course, is that if those reforms are deepened, it would obviously hurt people more. So some clarity on that.
So first of all, IMF came and gave certain reasons why some countries are doing well, but generally, there are good news and also some reasons to improve on certain areas. So first of all, if you look at, as I said, countries reforming and implementing fiscal consolidation, and of course, fiscal consolidation means you are reducing debt, you're also reducing deficit. Then also, there is inflation is coming down. Then also, there is also foreign exchange stability more or less emerging. Then also, the second good news is that African countries are now having access to Euro bond, like Kenya and other countries are now issuing Euro bonds, maybe 8.5, 8 point something interest rate and all that. And there are also growth in certain countries. So if we use this summary to look at Nigeria, so the confusion that we have in Nigeria is that while the monetary authorities in Nigeria are more or less doing tightening with regards to interest rate increase, the fiscal authority seems to be expanding. So there is now a request by the government to borrow more money. So there seems to be a kind of confusion in terms of what we are doing in Nigeria. So you are saying we are supposed to do fiscal consolidation, but what we are seeing from monetary authorities is a kind of contraction, but the fiscal authorities is expanding. Then in terms of inflation, inflation is still going up in Nigeria, so it's not coming down as other African countries. Then foreign exchange stability is still a bit volatile, while, because of course you see Naira is exchanging maybe 17, 18, so there's no stability. So in these three key areas, that Nigeria is not as we are seeing in other African countries. But Nigeria is not the only country experiencing some of these challenges. But what not only IMF, but even other people are saying, that there's a need for better sequencing of these reforms. There's a need for better engagement with Nigerians with regards to the benefits of these reforms, communicating with Nigerians. There's also a need for better calibrating of these reforms in terms of when do you implement this, when do you implement that. And if you're able to do that, it means that government can also signal with regards to their commitment to implementing some of these reforms. So there seems to be a kind of confusion between what is being said and what is being done and the outcome that we're experiencing. So remember that Nigeria is not under any IMF program at the moment. As I said, IMF provides reports, provides advice. So it's now left for us to look at the advice and say, okay, are there things that we can pick from the report of IMF to improve what we are doing in Nigeria?
So what is your sense then? What are the things that we can pick from that to improve what is happening in Nigeria?
There are a few things that we are supposed to do. One is that the way the reforms have been implemented is a bit, can be a bit confusing. We said earlier on that removal of subsidy is fine, but floating the Naira at the same time with removal of the subsidy can be said to be flawed. Then the communication of the reforms to the public and the engagement can be a lot better. Then the government signaling that they are ready to do proper reduction of cost of governance can also be better as well. Then also the coordination between the federal government and the state government and the local government can also be better. You can see what is going on with the tax bill, whereby some of the governors are saying, no, we cannot implement, we don't want the tax bill. The federal government are saying, we have to go ahead with this tax bill. They have to go and debate it in the National Assembly and other things. So the government can sit back and say, this reform that we've implemented, what have been the outcomes in terms of, are we having reduction in inflation? Is interest rate stabilizing? Is foreign exchange stabilizing? Are we experiencing growth? Is poverty reducing? Is unemployment reducing? All these are indices or ways you can assess the effectiveness of the reforms. And surprisingly, as I said, we are trying to do fiscal consolidation in terms of reducing deficit, reducing borrowing, but the government is still borrowing. In the 2025 budget that has been, you can see what they're saying they're going to borrow. Recurrent expenditure is maybe about 14 trillion. Debt service is about 15 trillion. Capital expenditure is about 13 trillion. So it's quite confusing in the way the government has been going about these reforms. And then these reports coming out from IMF, from World Bank, from Lagos Business School and other places will supposed to help the government to rethink and assess these reforms to see the areas they have to make amends, because we are not really seeing the kind of outcomes we want.
Indeed. And just looking at your analysis there and your very good summary of what the IMF was suggesting, I wonder if they're cognizant of the impact of these reforms on the Nigerian people and whether those points the IMF is raising actually deal with the problems that Nigerians are facing. Any of it?
I think, let me reiterate, the report by IMF focused on sub-Saharan Africa, not just on Nigeria. But given our relevance in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, given the reforms that we're already having in Nigeria, the report provides a good document for us to use to review the reforms that we're implementing to see areas that we can improve. There is something that is called regulatory impact assessment, that the government can sit back and say, we've done this for 18 months. Are they working? Are they not working? And how can we improve what we are doing? So we are moving into 2025 now. The main challenge that we are actually having is that there is no clear explanation of the economic policies of the government. So if you say, what is the economic agenda, development agenda of the government? So if you want to do an economic development plan, you say, this is where we are, this is where we want to go, this is how we want to achieve it. So this current government, it will come to an end in 2027, then there will be another election. So the question is, what kind of Nigeria do we want by May 2027? So are we expecting to see inflation coming down? What target are we looking at? Are we expecting unemployment to come down? What target are we looking at in 2027? Poverty rate, what level are we expecting? Industrialization, what level are we expecting? So these are the things that we expect to have well documented, well discussed, well communicated, so that people can really know that this is where we are going. And also, all these reforms being implemented, what are the targets that we are trying to achieve? So if we are saying that we are pursuing inflation, what target are we pursuing? So there's a need for a more robust examination, assessment, and communication of the reforms by the government. And I keep saying, irrespective of what we do, what is very important is in terms of how do we improve our productivity. There is still no clear, convincing, communicated policy on how to ramp up industrialization. So those are some of the things that we're supposed to do that I think that all the reports that we are getting and we are seeing, both from known institutions, individuals, and other organizations, that the government can use to engage Nigerians to have a better outcome.
Well, to be entirely fair, the government did set some targets very publicly. I mean, they set an inflation target. They've missed it by, miles, if you like. I mean, they've set a couple of other targets, growth targets and all the rest of them, and they didn't meet those targets. But You mentioned earlier the budget, so this new budget. So let me get your assessment of it. It's about 47.9 trillion naira, which I understand is about $28 billion. Many analysts are saying that due to the devaluation of the naira, inflation, etc., it's worth less than the previous budget and therefore will deliver less when they should be doing more. I mean, what's your take on that?
My take on the budget is that I think that while in dollar terms is about 20-something, not up to $30 billion, depending on exchange rate you use, I think that there are a few things that need to be properly examined. So if you look at the target for revenue, I think we are looking to achieve about 25 trillion this year. Then, of course, next year, you are now moving it up to 30-something trillion. So the question is, what will you do differently that will ramp up revenue from where we are now to what we want to achieve in 2025? Meanwhile, just as you pointed out, we have targets, but we are missing almost all our targets for 2024. So secondly, if you look at the initial breakdown of the budget, so they are saying that capital expenditure will be about 13 trillion, recurrent expenditure, I think about 14 trillion, and then debt service, about 15 trillion. So if you look at these three key areas, it's quite challenging. And I think it's something that we need to rethink very, very well. And they're also saying that possibly our oil production will go up. The price for oil will be about $70. But if you focus on debt service, remember that during PMB's regime, we were all shouting when we are using about 3-point-something trillion, 4 trillion, 5 trillion, 6 trillion to service debts. Now we are going to use about 15 trillion to service debts. And from what we've read and what we've seen, maybe around 2027, our total budget, our total debt will be about over 150 trillion. I'm not sure it's very sustainable because most of the time we normally say that our debt to GDP ratio is still very okay, this. But what of the revenue that we are generating? And then using about 15 trillion to service debts, it's quite, it demands proper and further examination in terms of the sustainability of this approach. Remember that we've been complaining right from PMB's regime, the way the government is borrowing and keep borrowing and keep borrowing and keep borrowing and keep borrowing. We just read that the current government has written to the National Assembly requesting to borrow about 2-point-something billion again. Next year, they're going to borrow more. So the question is, where is the end to this continuous borrowing? And what are the impacts on this present generation, on the next generation, or what we call intergenerational consequences of this kind of borrowing? So it's quite challenging. And so while in terms of naira terms, the gap is high, in dollar terms is lower, but we need to rethink recurrent expenditure, debt service. The way the recurrent expenditure has gone up from what it was this year to what it's going to be next year is also quite concerning. But the key areas for me is recurrent expenditure and debt service, and then the reduction or maybe the way these two big items are higher than the capital expenditure.
And I don't suppose in all your discussions with sort of IMF, what is going on in your Lagos Business School, which is always coming up with all these sort of, very good sort of advice and so on. I don't suppose anybody is talking about the scaling back model in terms of the downsizing of government and spending less on it as the way to go.
I think that is a public knowledge that is highly demanded, required. So, and that's what earlier on I told you that the government needs to signal that they are committed to some of these reforms. So the idea of having 40-something ministers, many special advisors, and also some of the contract or projects being implemented. The question is, if a country is passing through difficulties the way we are passing, are we supposed to be pursuing some of these kind of ambitious or very, would I say, expanded cabinet level projects that might not be assessed or examined to be extremely vital for the sustainability and survival of the country? So that's a challenge. So in terms of government signaling, I think Nigerians are still asking the government to signal that they are committed to reducing the cost of governance, particularly in terms of the kind of appointments we are seeing, the kind of projects being executed, and the kind of also other expenditures that we hear and see from time to time. And of course, when it's done by the federal government, we expect to see the same thing at the state level, at the local government level, and all the federal government agencies. And then gradually, Nigerians will also believe and perceive the government as being totally committed to reducing the cost of governance, which is very, very vital, which will also help maybe investors to also believe that we mean business in terms of restructuring the country, in terms of restructuring the governance, in terms of restructuring the revenue, in terms of restructuring the expenditure, and other things that we are supposed to do with regards to the reforms.
Now, just before we let you go, just returning to that budget, I'm wondering how you square it with the growth expectations for 2025, which the government has put at 4%, because in dollar terms, from what I understand, the total expenditure declined by 27% because they're using 1,400 naira to the dollar, whereas last year they used 800 naira to the dollar. So while it increased the budget in naira terms by 35%, according to economists like Bismarck Rewani, if you discount for inflation, there'll be no growth at all. And if you dollarize the budget, there was a 27% decline in total expenditure. So how do you square that with growth expectations for 2025, which is 4%?
I think, let me first of all say that in this current 2024, about 10 African countries are listed among the countries that will experience the highest economic growth globally in the world. And then 17 African countries are also listed as going to experience above 5% economic growth this year. And even in the report the IMF report, it's believed that averagely, Africa will experience about 4-point-something% economic growth. So if we are, as the giant of Africa, we are targeting just 4%, I think that is not very ambitious. I think that we can do a lot better. I think that we can do a lot more if we're able to get, as I say, rethinking all these reforms and saying which areas can we improve, which areas can we do better. And given the population growth, given the inflation, and given, as you said, what Bismarck Rewani said, which is true, if we discount some of these factors, it means that the growth is grossly inadequate to sustain the country in terms of population, in terms of what we expect to achieve. So I think that is something that government needs to sit back and rethink in terms of what can we do, like what other African countries are doing. Some of them are experiencing 7% growth, 6% growth this year, and they will also experience higher growth by next year. So I think that Nigeria, as the giant of Africa, can do a lot better than what we are doing at the moment. And is it possible? Yes, it is very, very possible.
Okay, on that potentially hopeful note, I want to thank you very much indeed. Dr. Franklin Ngwu is the director of the Public Sector Initiative at the Lagos Business School. He's also an associate professor in strategy, corporate governance and risk management. And he was talking to me from our studios in Lagos.